Hello and welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Transatlantic relations are facing fresh pressure, from divisions inside NATO after the Iran crisis to growing political uncertainty in Central Europe ahead of Hungary's election. Joining us today on TVP World to break down what this means for alliance cohesion and Europe's strategic direction is Kristen Taylor, Associate Director at the Transatlantic Security Initiative of Atlantic Council. She focuses on NATO and European security with deep expertise in transatlantic policy and alliance dynamics. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me today.
Right. So we are looking at this whole Iran crisis and Trump's call to action, which was, subsequently denied by a lot of European nations. Do you think we should look at this as an isolated strategic disagreement within NATO or a more broader distrust between Washington and Europe?
Absolutely. I think it's clear to say that Washington and Europe are addressing U.S. Israeli attacks in Iran very differently. How this fits into the broader partnership of transatlantic relations, I think we'll kind of see how that impacts broader trust. Washington engaged in these actions without consulting European allies first, which certainly took many by surprise. I would anticipate this to erode trust in the transatlantic partnership more broadly. But not to have specific effects on the broader transatlantic relationship moving forward in terms of U.S. commitment to the NATO alliance.
Right. Do you think if the allies refuse military participation, it will confirm Trump's charge that NATO is politically divided? He's seem to be framing this as some sort of a test to see if NATO allies will come to his aid. But do you think this line of logic is coherent?
I think that it's important to note that the Trump administration tends to view actions more discreetly and likes to act towards allies more transactionally and bilaterally than we've seen for previous U.S. administrations. I think from that analytical lens, it makes the Donald Trump administration looking to European allies to engage and using that as a broader testament to their commitment to NATO. It does make sense coherently if you're looking at it from that frame. However, I think that the Trump administration is looking more to individual allies to see about their participation. It's important to note that the United States has not asked NATO as an institution to date to engage in Iran. And NATO as an institution would have a limited role should the United States ask and allies accept. So this is more of a bilateral call from Trump to individual European allies that European allies have not answered to date. And any engagement with the NATO alliance is a little bit different. It would be interesting to see what a testament, if the United States were to ask NATO to get involved, what that would mean politically. But I would say that as a general rule, Donald Trump sees European allies more broadly as part of NATO commitment.
All right, thanks so much for helping us make that distinction. I think we tend to get lost in the sauce because these are NATO allies, and that's the kind of framing that we approach it. But yeah, it does seem like the Trump administration is approaching this as an individual country-to-country bilateral basis. However, he did threaten, at least use very strong words against NATO, saying that, NATO might be going down a pretty bad path, or whatever wording he uses does directly address NATO, though. Do you think that this is the kind of rhetoric that he's using to, give the allies a little bit of nudge? Do we call it a threat? What do you think the strategic calculus is behind it?
Absolutely. He certainly has been taking aim at NATO. I mean, even just today, he posted on Truth Social calling NATO a paper tiger. That's certainly something to keep in mind. But when asked on Tuesday whether or not European reluctance to engage in Iran had him rethinking U.S. commitment to NATO, he said that that wasn't something that he was currently considering. So I would say as the alliance more broadly, it's right now based on his rhetoric. He certainly is coupling them together, but he's not yet saying that that's impacting U.S. commitment to the alliance. I think if you're looking at Donald Trump taking broader aim at Europeans' allies for their reluctance to engage in Iran, what I would be looking at is U.S. commitment to Ukraine. Donald Trump has kind of tied European reluctance in this regard to engage directly with U.S. support for Ukraine. So I would expect any political price to be paid there for this decision to be how the administration continues to engage with Ukraine.
Right? Can you help us elaborate a little bit about that? What do you think? What do you mean by the political price?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the Trump administration and Europe have had a bit of daylight between US-led negotiations for Russia and Ukraine. This administration has taken a more direct approach to Ukraine than the previous US administration and has called for Ukraine to come to the table. That was kind of coming out of Geneva talks last month. I would expect that rhetoric to sharpen, and I would expect that there will be some continued conversation on the U.S. side about the calls on negotiations for Russia and the U.S., Russia and Ukraine. On that same note, though, we're seeing some European leaders, like the Finnish President Stubb, who have publicly said that they would consider supporting U.S. efforts in Iran if the United States were to bolster their support to Ukraine. So I think we'll see in the coming days and weeks the Ukraine and Iran conflicts being tied together a little bit more politically in relation to the transatlantic partnership.
Right, and you rightfully pointed out earlier there that a lot of EU leaders were caught by surprise by Trump's move, and I think they've been scrambling to try to come up with a coherent response as well. Now, you have sent some mixed signals there. On one hand, pushing restraint while also preparing sort of economic and security responses. They do have incentive to help patrol the Strait of Hormuz, but also seem quite reluctant to do so. Do you think this speaks more of strategic flexibility, or does it risk looking like inconsistency in the eyes of the Washington administration?
No, that's a great question. This is not Europe's war, but it certainly is Europe's problem. Given proximity, Europe is going to struggle based on what we're seeing now with soaring energy prices, economic insecurity, potential human security issues, particularly related to migration. So the European Union leaders are certainly looking to try and balance their strategic security interests with some of the second order effects that they'll be seeing from the U.S. Israeli attacks in Iran. So I think what we're seeing from European leaders right now is trying to figure out how to strike that balance. And I think that in turn, you're seeing Washington see this as European reluctance to engage directly, which impacts how the United States seeks to kind of convince European allies to come along in U.S. attacks in Iran.
Do you think this eventually will cause any sort of fracture in cohesion? With Europe perhaps thinking about its own strategic autonomy and independent from U.S. leadership?
Certainly. I think the latest wave of rhetoric against NATO, against European allies from the Trump administration certainly will undermine trust. It's not a one-off. This is part of a broader pattern. We've seen this rhetoric before. And while it hasn't erupted into broader or more permanent repercussions for the NATO alliance, I think that it will start to slowly erode a lot of the trust that's built up there. But I think this moves past just Iran and is also something to consider in terms of a broader pattern, whether that be U.S. provocative rhetoric and actions in relation to Greenland, or even now U.S. interest in Hungarian elections, more from a domestic point of view, all of which have Europe questioning U.S. commitments and more broadly what U.S. long-term vision and policy is for the transatlantic partnership.
Right. I'd actually like to touch on the Hungary topic as well, since you just brought it up, because we are looking at U.S. political figures strongly backing Viktor Orban, and who is, well, in this part of the world, kind of seen as the black sheep of the family. Do you think that that's also something that might have impact on U.S.-EU relations?
Absolutely. I think we're seeing from this administration very much an acceptance of Hungary, but more so an acceptance of Viktor Orban, even with some U.S. officials tying kind of U.S. Hungarian bilateral relations to Viktor Orban, kind of keeping his seat there. I think it's an embrace more broadly from this administration of conservative values for leaders abroad, which is a bit of a break from longstanding U.S. policy to not comment on domestic elections of allies. I would expect for the U.S. European Union relation it to certainly have some effects. The European Union obviously has struggled with Viktor Orban, even currently, with blocks to previously agreed upon aid to Ukraine. I would expect that the European Union will see this as the U.S. interfering in elections, and that it will more broadly erode that trust between Washington and Brussels.
Do you think this upcoming election could also be used as some sort of litmus test to see how much influence the Trump administration and Washington actually have on Europe? Or do you think the domestic dispute within Hungary in and of itself might just overshadow this endorsement?
Absolutely. I would be careful to use a litmus test of just one country as more broadly reflective of the political values of different countries across Europe, just because there are so many varying perceptions across Europe of Washington and of its kind of influence over Europe. I think in Hungary, U.S. endorsement of Viktor Orban can certainly impact what is shaping up to be a very tight race. Whether or not that would be indicative of broader influence and interference in other elections, I think is something to kind of keep an eye on moving forward.
All right, definitely. And we do also have to keep an eye on how bilateral relations and transatlantic relations develop. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.